The blood-soaked bandana tied around Wade Ravenwood's knuckles did little to mask the pain as he brought the whiskey glass to his lips. Outside the saloon, Durango, Colorado Territory, 1875, was bustling with afternoon activity, but inside, the darkness swallowed him whole just as he preferred it these days. "Ain't seen you smile in months, Ravenwood," the bartender said, wiping down the counter. "Starting to think your face might crack if you tried." Wade drained his glass and slid it forward for a refill. "Not much to smile about, Joe. Not anymore." The bartender's eyes softened with understanding. Everyone in Silverton knew Wade's story, the ruthless gang that had raided his homestead 2 years ago while he was away, taking not just his possessions but his wife, Sarah. By the time he'd tracked them down across 3 territories, it had been too late. The broken man who'd returned to Silverton afterward was just a shadow of the respected rancher he'd once been. "Mail coach brought something for you," Joe said, sliding an envelope across the bar. "From the marshal's office in Denver." Wade stared at it with disinterest before tucking it into his vest pocket. Whatever it contained could wait. These days, nothing seemed particularly urgent. He paid for his drink and stepped out into the harsh Colorado sunshine, squinting as the light hit his eyes. Silverton had grown since he'd first settled here 7 years ago. The silver mines had brought prosperity, with the Denver and Rio Grande Railway spur now connecting their once isolated mountain town to the wider world. Wade hardly noticed the changes anymore. He rode into town when supplies ran low, avoided most social gatherings, and spent his days working his cattle ranch with minimal help, just enough hands to keep things running. As he untied his horse from the post, a commotion at the stagecoach station caught his attention. The afternoon coach had arrived, and passengers were disembarking, mostly miners and a few businessmen in suits. But among them stood a woman unlike any Wade had seen in Silverton before. Her chestnut hair was pinned beneath a modest hat, but a few wayward strands caught the breeze. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had seen better days, and she clutched a small carpet bag as she looked around, clearly searching for someone or something. There was a quiet determination in her stance that made Wade pause. He turned away. Other people's business was no concern of his anymore. The letter in his pocket could wait until he returned to his ranch. Wade mounted his horse and rode out of town, the familiar path winding through aspen groves before opening up to the valley where his ranch sprawled across 300 acres. The place had once been full of promise and dreams. Now it was just land and cattle, a means to exist, nothing more. At the ranch house, Wade removed his horse's saddle and brushed the animal down before finally pulling out the envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the Denver marshal's seal was unmistakable. Inside was a brief letter. "Mr. Ravenwood, we've apprehended Thomas Blackwell, the last member of the gang responsible for the attack on your property and the death of your wife. Trial set for next month in Denver. Your testimony will be required." Marshal James Cooper Wade stared at the paper until the words blurred. 2 years of hunting, and the last man had finally been caught. He should feel something: satisfaction, relief, closure. Instead, there was just the same hollow ache that had become his constant companion. That night, sleep eluded him as it often did. When dawn broke, Wade had already decided he would leave for Denver the following day. Not because he cared about justice anymore, but because perhaps seeing the last of Sarah's killers face judgment might finally allow him to put the past to rest. When he rode back into Silverton to make arrangements for his ranch during his absence, the town seemed unusually active for a Tuesday morning. Outside the general store, he noticed the same woman from the stagecoach, engaged in animated conversation with Mr. Peterson, the store owner. "I'm afraid I can't extend credit, Miss Richards," Peterson was saying loudly enough for Wade to overhear. "Not without knowing you've secured employment or have means." "I understand," the woman replied, her voice steady despite the obvious disappointment. "I'll find another way." There was something in her tone, a quiet resilience that made Wade linger longer than he intended. As Peterson retreated into his store, the woman stood on the boardwalk, consulting a piece of paper before straightening her shoulders and walking toward the newspaper office. Wade tied his horse and entered the general store. After arranging for supplies to be delivered to his ranch hands, he found himself asking Peterson. The woman outside new to town, Peterson nodded. Says her name's Emma Richards. Came on yesterday's coach from Boston, of all places. Looking for work as a teacher or such, but we ain't had a proper school since Miss Thompson left last winter. He shook his head. Shame, really. Seems educated and proper, but Silverton's no place for an unaccompanied woman without prospects. Wade grunted noncommittally and finished his business. Outside, he noticed Miss Richards emerging from the newspaper office, her expression slightly more dejected than before. It was none of his concern. He had his own troubles, his own ghosts. The last thing he needed was to involve himself in a stranger's predicament. Yet as he mounted his horse, he found himself watching as she made her way toward the boarding house, her steps determined despite her obvious setbacks. Just another lost soul in a town full of them, Wade thought, turning his horse toward the marshal's office to inform them of his impending departure for Denver. The next morning, Wade loaded his saddlebags for the journey. The train would take him as far as Durango and from there to Denver. As he passed the town's only cafe, he noticed Miss Richards sitting alone by the window, a cup of coffee and a single piece of toast before her, as she studied a newspaper intently. Something about her struck him, not just her obvious beauty, which he'd noted dispassionately the day before, but the way she held herself. There was no defeat in her posture despite what must have been a string of rejections throughout town. Before he realized what he was doing, Wade had tied his horse and entered the cafe. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, standing beside her table. Emma Richards looked up, startled. Her eyes were a clear hazel, intelligent and wary. "Do I know you, sir?" Wade Ravenwood, he said, removing his hat. "I own a ranch outside of town." She hesitated before gesturing to the chair opposite her. "Emma Richards, please sit if you'd like." Wade signaled to the waitress for coffee before turning his attention back to Miss Richards. Up close, he noticed the small freckles across her nose and the way her hair, partially escaped from its pins, caught the morning light. "I couldn't help overhearing yesterday," Wade began awkwardly, realizing he hadn't engaged in proper conversation with a woman in years. "You're looking for work as a teacher," Emma straightened. "Yes. I came west because I read that frontier towns are desperate for educated women to teach their children." A small frown crossed her features, though I'm finding Silverton seems to be an exception. "The mining company had plans for a proper schoolhouse," Wade explained, "but after the silver prices dropped last year, they abandoned the project. Most families either teach their children at home or send them to boarding schools in Denver or back east if they can afford it." She nodded, disappointment evident despite her composed expression. "I see. Well, I suppose I'll need to continue on to another town." She glanced out the window. "Once I can afford passage." Wade studied her for a moment. "You're traveling alone, no family or connections out here." A flash of something pain perhaps crossed her face before she schooled her features. "My circumstances have changed recently. I needed a fresh start." Wade knew all about needing a fresh start, though his attempt had failed miserably. Before he could respond, the cafe door opened, and Marshal Turner walked in, spotting Wade immediately. "Ravenwood, just the man I was looking for." The marshal approached their table. "Got word from Denver. They're moving up Blackwell's trial." "You'll need to leave today if you want to make it in time," Wade nodded, his jaw tightening. "I was planning to catch the afternoon train." The marshal noticed Emma and tipped his hat. "Madam, don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Marshal Turner." "Emma Richards," she replied with a polite smile. "Miss Richards is looking for work as a teacher," Wade found himself saying. "Thought you might know of opportunities given your connections in the county." The marshal scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Can't say I do, miss, though." He looked at Wade with an odd expression. "Ravenwood here has a fine house on his ranch, been sitting mostly empty since." He stopped abruptly, glancing uncomfortably at Wade. Emma looked between them, clearly sensing the sudden tension. Wade cleared his throat. "I need to be in Denver for at least 2 weeks for this trial. My ranch hands are capable, but they'll be busy with the cattle." The words were coming out of his mouth before he'd fully processed them. "I could use someone to keep an eye on the house." Maybe help my foreman with the accounts while I'm gone. Emma's eyes widened slightly. Mr. Ravenwood, we've only just met. I couldn't possibly. It would be a fair exchange, Wade insisted, surprising himself with the offer. You need lodging and income. I need someone trustworthy to watch the place. When I return, if it doesn't work out, I'll personally pay for your stagecoach fare to any town of your choosing. The marshal looked as surprised as Emma did, but he nodded approvingly. Ravenwood's the most respected rancher in these parts, Miss Richards. His offer is genuine, I can vouch for that. Emma studied Wade's face, and he wondered what she saw there, the grief, the hardness, the emptiness, but something in her expression softened. Let me understand correctly, she said carefully. You're offering me temporary employment and lodging at your ranch while you're away in Denver, and upon your return, we'll reassess the arrangement, Wade nodded. My foreman, Miguel, lives in the small cabin near the main house with his wife. They're good people, you'll be safe. For a long moment, Emma considered his proposal, her intelligent eyes never leaving his face. Then, to his surprise, a small smile curved her lips. Very well, Mr. Ravenwood, I accept your offer. And just like that, for reasons he couldn't explain, Wade had invited a stranger into his home, the home he'd once shared with Sarah. The home he'd avoided spending more time in than necessary for the past 2 years. 3 hours later, Wade found himself leading Emma Richards up the path to his ranch house. Miguel and his wife, Lucia, stood on the porch, clearly curious about the unexpected visitor. Miss Richards will be staying here while I'm in Denver, Wade explained after making introductions. She'll help with the household accounts and correspondence. Miguel nodded respectfully, though Wade caught the surprise in his foreman's eyes. No one had stayed in the main house besides Wade since Sarah's death. Lucia will show you to the guest room, Wade told Emma. It's been a while since we've had visitors, so I apologize if it's not as comfortable as you're used to. I'm sure it will be perfectly adequate, Emma replied with that same quiet dignity that had first caught his attention. Thank you again for this opportunity, Mr. Ravenwood. As Lucia led Emma inside, Miguel stepped closer to Wade. Are you sure about this, patron? He asked quietly. A woman you just met, Wade watched Emma disappear into the house. No, he answered honestly, but she needs help and I need to be in Denver. Miguel studied him for a moment, then nodded. We will look after her. Do not worry about the ranch. Wade spent the next hour explaining the ranch operations and showing Emma where he kept the ledgers and correspondence. She listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that revealed she was indeed well educated. The train leaves in 2 hours, Wade finally said, picking up his packed saddlebags. Miguel knows everything about the cattle operation. If there's anything about the house or accounts you need, Lucia can send a telegram to Denver. Emma stood in the middle of his study, afternoon light streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes around her. For a moment, Wade was struck by how right she looked there, how the room suddenly felt lived in again. I'll take good care of everything, she promised, and I'm grateful for your trust, unexpected as it may be. Wade simply nodded, uncomfortable with the strange feelings stirring inside him, the first real feelings besides grief and anger he'd experienced in years. I'll return in 2 weeks, perhaps 3, he said gruffly, turning to leave. Make yourself at home. As he rode away from the ranch, Wade questioned his own sanity. He'd just left a complete stranger in charge of his home, all because something in her determined gaze had spoken to him. Or perhaps it was simply that helping her gave him a momentary escape from his own demons. Either way, as the train pulled away from Durango that evening, Wade found himself thinking of Emma Richards and her quiet resilience, instead of the trial that awaited him in Denver. Denver was larger and more chaotic than Wade remembered. The city had grown substantially in the years since his last visit, with new buildings stretching skyward and streets teeming with carriages, wagons, and pedestrians. The marshal's office arranged a room for him at a boarding house near the courthouse, where he would be expected to testify against Thomas Blackwell. On his second day in the city, Wade finally came face to face with the last member of the gang that had destroyed his life. Blackwell was a surprisingly ordinary-looking man, not the monster Wade had built up in his mind. As they locked eyes across the courtroom, Wade felt an emptiness where rage should have been. Killing the other gang members during his hunt had brought no peace. Perhaps seeing this one hang legally would be different. The trial proceeded slowly. Wade testified about finding his ransacked home, about tracking the gang across 3 territories, about identifying items stolen from his ranch among their possessions. Throughout it all, he spoke mechanically, as if describing events that had happened to someone else. The attorneys and judge called it an open and shut case, but legal proceedings still dragged on in the evenings. Alone in his boarding house room, Wade found his thoughts drifting back to Silverton and to Emma Richards. He wondered how she was settling in, whether she found his ledgers comprehensible, whether she was comfortable in his home. These thoughts were a welcome distraction from memories of Sarah and the nightmare of her final days. After the first week, Wade sent a telegram to his ranch. Trial proceeding stop, likely another week stop. Is everything well? Query Ravenwood. The reply came the following morning. All well at ranch. Stop accounts organized. Stop. Take your time. Stop. Richards. The simple message shouldn't have brought him any particular comfort. Yet Wade found himself reading it multiple times. There was something reassuring about knowing life continued at his ranch, that someone was caring for the home he'd neglected for so long. As the second week of the trial began, the prosecution presented evidence linking Blackwell directly to Sarah's death. Wade sat stone-faced as the details were recounted, details he already knew, details that haunted his dreams. Blackwell showed no remorse, maintaining the blank expression of a man who had long ago abandoned his humanity. When the jury finally delivered their verdict guilty on all counts, Wade felt nothing but a hollow sense of completion. The judge sentenced Blackwell to hang at the end of the month. Justice, they called it, though it did nothing to fill the emptiness inside Wade. You can return to Silverton with the knowledge he'll never hurt anyone else, the prosecutor told Wade afterward, clearly expecting him to show some satisfaction. Wade merely nodded. If there's nothing else, I'll be leaving on tomorrow's train. That night, unable to sleep, Wade found himself writing a letter not to Miguel or anyone at the ranch, but to Emma. He stared at the blank paper for a long time before finally setting his pen to it. Miss Richards, the trial has concluded. Blackwell was found guilty and sentenced to hang. I will be returning to Silverton tomorrow. I hope you found the ranch agreeable in my absence. W. Ravenwood. He stared at the sparse words, dissatisfied with their inadequacy but unable to express anything more. Wade sealed the letter but never sent it, tucking it into his saddlebag instead. The journey back to Silverton seemed longer than the trip to Denver had been. As the train wound through the mountains, Wade gazed out the window, struck by the beauty of the landscape he'd become blind to over the past 2 years. For the first time in a long while, he found himself looking forward to reaching his destination. It was late afternoon when Wade's horse carried him up the familiar path to his ranch. The sight that greeted him made him rein in abruptly. The porch of his house had been swept clean, windows washed, and most surprisingly flower boxes had appeared beneath the front windows, filled with late summer mountain blooms. As he approached, the front door opened and Emma stepped out. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking far more at ease than she had 2 weeks prior. Seeing him, she smiled a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Welcome back, Mr. Ravenwood," she called. "We've been expecting you." Wade dismounted slowly, taking in the changes to his home. "Miss Richards," he acknowledged, leading his horse toward the hitching post. "I see you've been busy." She walked down the porch steps to meet him. "I hope you don't mind the flowers. The house seemed to need a little color." Up close, Wade noticed a smudge of flour on her cheek and caught the unmistakable aroma of fresh bread coming from inside. The scent brought back memories so powerful he had to look away for a moment. "I don't mind," he managed, though his voice sounded rough to his own ears. Emma studied his face. The trial, it went as expected. Wade nodded, unsure how much to say. "It's over. He'll hang." Something in Emma's eyes, understanding perhaps, or compassion, made Wade feel exposed, as though she could see through the walls he'd built around himself. "I made venison stew," she said after a moment. Miguel brought the meat yesterday, and there's fresh bread if you're hungry after your journey. The simple offer of a home-cooked meal shouldn't have affected him so deeply, but Wade found himself momentarily unable to speak. He nodded instead, turning to unsaddle his horse. "I'll just see to my horse first," he said, needing a moment to compose himself. "Of course. Take your time." As Emmer returned to the house, Wade led his horse to the stable, moving through the familiar motions of removing the saddle and brushing the animal down. The normalcy of the task helped settle his unexpected emotions. When he finally entered the house, Wade paused in the doorway. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The rooms felt lived in again. A vase of wildflowers sat on the sideboard. Books that had long sat untouched on shelves were now arranged on the table, some with bookmarks suggesting recent use. The layer of dust that had settled over everything was gone. The smell of stew and fresh bread led him to the kitchen, where he found Emma standing at the stove stirring the pot. She looked up when he entered, that same warm smile gracing her features. "Perfect timing," she said. "It's just ready." Wade washed his hands in the basin before joining her at the table. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Emma spoke again. "Miguel has kept everything running smoothly with the cattle," she reported, "and I've organized your ledgers and correspondence. There were several letters requiring responses, which I've drafted for your approval." Wade looked up from his stew, surprised by her efficiency. "You've accomplished more in 2 weeks than I have in months." A slight blush colored her cheeks. "I've always been good with organization, and I needed to feel useful." For the first time, Wade found himself truly curious about this woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. "You mentioned you came from Boston. What brought you all the way to Colorado?" Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully. "My father's business failed. He took his own life 6 months ago." The stark admission hung in the air between them. "I'm sorry," Wade said, meaning it. She nodded, meeting his eyes directly. "After his death, I discovered he had accumulated substantial debts. Our house, his business, everything was sold to pay the creditors. My mother had passed years earlier, and I have no siblings." Her voice remained steady, though Wade detected the pain beneath her composure. "I had been teaching at a ladies' seminary in Boston, but after the scandal of my father's suicide and bankruptcy, they asked me to resign." Wade felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "That's unjust, perhaps, but it's the way of things." Emma pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I read an article about the need for teachers in Western territories. It seemed a chance to start anew where no one knew my family's disgrace." The resilience in her voice struck a chord in Wade. Here was someone else who had lost everything, yet unlike him, she hadn't surrendered to grief and isolation. She had picked up what remained and traveled thousands of miles to build something new. "And now," he asked, "what are your plans?" Emma met his gaze steadily. "That depends on you, Mr. Ravenwood. Our arrangement was temporary until your return. If you're satisfied with my work, I'd like to stay on at least until I've earned enough for passage to another town with need of a teacher." Wade considered her request, aware that he should feel reluctance at the idea of sharing his space, of disrupting the solitary existence he'd created. Instead, he found himself nodding. "The position is yours for as long as you need it," he said. "You've brought order back to this place." The smile that illuminated her face made something stir in Wade's chest, something he thought had died alongside Sarah. It unsettled him enough that he stood abruptly, taking his empty bowl to the wash basin. "I should check in with Miguel about the cattle," he said, needing distance from the unfamiliar feelings. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Richards. It's been a long time since I've had home cooking." As he escaped to the evening air, Wade told himself he was simply being a decent man, offering employment to someone in need. The way his heart had quickened when she smiled, that was nothing but surprise at finding his house transformed. It couldn't be anything more. He had sworn after Sarah that he would never love again, would never make himself vulnerable to that kind of loss. But as he walked toward Miguel's cabin, Wade couldn't deny that for the first time in 2 years, his ranch felt like a home again. The following weeks established a routine that gradually began to feel natural. Emma continued managing the household accounts and correspondence, while also taking over many of the domestic duties Wade had neglected since Sarah's death. He focused on the cattle operations, riding out with the hands most days and returning in the evenings to find the house warm and welcoming. They typically shared the evening meal, during which Emma would report on any business matters requiring his attention. Initially, their conversations remained practical, centered around the ranch. But as September gave way to October and the aspen leaves turned golden, Wade found himself lingering at the table longer, their discussions broadening to books, current events, and occasional stories from their pasts. One evening, as the first autumn chills settled over Silverton, Wade returned to find Emma on the porch, wrapped in a shawl and reading a book in the fading light. "You'll strain your eyes," he commented, dismounting and securing his horse. Emma looked up with a smile that had become a highlight of his days, though he was reluctant to admit it even to himself. "I wanted to enjoy the last of the sunset. The colors in these mountains are unlike anything I've seen." Wade glanced at the horizon, where purple and gold streaked across the sky behind the rugged peaks. It had been years since he'd stopped to appreciate such things. "We get spectacular sunsets before the snow sets in," he said, joining her on the porch. "Another month and the passes will start closing. Winters are harsh here." "So I've heard," Emma replied, marking her place in her book. "Miguel's wife has been teaching me to preserve food for the season. I've put up jars of peaches and apples from the old orchard behind the house." Wade looked at her in surprise. "You found the orchard. I haven't been back there since," he stopped abruptly. "Since your wife," Emma finished softly. "Miguel told me a little about what happened. I hope that wasn't an intrusion." Wade leaned against the porch railing, his back to the sunset. "No, it's no secret in these parts." He was silent for a moment before adding, "Sarah planted those trees our first year here. She was determined to make this place flourish." Emma's expression held no pity, only a quiet understanding that made it easier for Wade to continue. "She would have liked what you've done with the house," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Something warm flickered in Emma's eyes. "Thank you for saying that." The moment stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with something Wade wasn't ready to name. "Mr. Peterson at the general store mentioned there might be a town meeting soon about establishing a proper school," Emma said, changing the subject. "Apparently, several new families have settled in the valley this year, with more children than the town's seen before." Wade nodded. "The silver mines are bringing steady work again. Silverton's growing." He suggested I might present myself as a candidate for teacher, should the town approve the funding. There was a hint of excitement in her voice that Wade hadn't heard before. "You'd be good at it," he said honestly. "The children would be fortunate." Emma tilted her head, studying him with those perceptive eyes. "It would mean staying in Silverton permanently, finding lodging in town." The thought of Emma leaving the ranch created an unexpected hollow feeling in Wade's chest. He'd grown accustomed to her presence, to the light she'd brought back into the house. "There's no need for that," he found himself saying. "The ranch is close enough to town. You could continue staying here." "In what capacity?" Emma asked directly, her gaze steady. "As your bookkeeper." "Or as a boarder?" The question hung between them, forcing Wade to consider the evolving nature of their arrangement. What had begun as a temporary solution had become something neither of them had defined. "Whichever you prefer," he finally answered. "The house is large enough, and He hesitated before admitting, "I've grown used to having you here." It was a small admission, but from a man who had walled himself off from all connections for 2 years, it was significant. Emma seemed to understand this, for her expression softened. "Then I'll stay," she said simply. "At least until the school situation is decided." They fell into companionable silence as darkness descended fully, the stars emerging one by one above the mountains. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Wade felt a sense of peace in the quiet moment they shared. When Emma finally rose to go inside, she paused beside him. "Would you like coffee?" "I was about to make some." Wade nodded, following her into the house that no longer echoed with emptiness. As October progressed, the town indeed voted to establish a school, with Emma unanimously approved as the teacher. Construction on the schoolhouse wouldn't be complete until spring, So for the winter months, classes would be held in the church building 3 days a week. Emma threw herself into preparations with an enthusiasm that Wade found himself admiring more each day. She rode into town regularly to meet the children who would become her students and to discuss curriculum with the town council. In the evenings, she would recount her experiences to Wade with animated gestures, her face alight with purpose. 10 students confirmed so far, she told him one night as they sat before the fire in his study. Snow had begun to dust the mountain peaks, and the evenings had grown cold enough to warrant fires in the hearths. Ages 6 to 14, with varying levels of previous education, Wade watched her over the rim of his coffee cup. Sounds challenging. Wonderfully so, Emma agreed, her eyes bright. I'll need to design individual learning plans for some of them. The Anderson twins have never had formal schooling, while the Douglas boy has apparently read half the classics already. You'll manage, Wade said, finding himself smiling at her enthusiasm. You've organized my chaotic accounts and correspondence. A classroom of children should be simple by comparison. Emma laughed a sound that had become increasingly frequent in the house, and one Wade had grown to look forward to. I wouldn't go that far, but I'm grateful for the opportunity. She hesitated, then added more softly, and grateful to you, Wade. Without your initial offer of employment, I might never have found a place here in Silverton. It was the first time she had used his given name rather than Mr. Ravenwood, and the intimacy of it caught him off guard. More surprising was how right it felt to hear it from her lips. You've earned your place, he said, attempting to maintain some distance even as he felt his carefully constructed walls continuing to crumble. The town's fortunate to have found a teacher of your caliber. Emma studied him for a moment, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You know, when we first met, I thought you were possibly the most taciturn man I'd ever encountered. Her tone was gently teasing. I'm finding that impression wasn't entirely accurate, Wade raised an eyebrow. No, she confirmed. Beneath that stern exterior, you're actually quite kind. And occasionally, when you forget to maintain your scowl, almost pleasant. Despite himself, Wade felt his lips twitch toward a smile. Don't spread that around town. I've cultivated my reputation as a humorless recluse very carefully. Emma's laugh was warm and genuine. Your secret is safe with me. The ease between them was new and slightly dangerous. Wade knew he should retreat, re-establish the boundaries he'd maintained for so long. Instead, he found himself asking, would you play something? He gestured toward the piano in the corner of the room, Sarah's piano, which had sat untouched since her death. Dust had gathered on its surface until Emma's arrival, though Wade had noticed she'd cleaned it without attempting to play it, respecting the unspoken significance of the instrument. Emma looked at the piano, then back at Wade, understanding in her eyes. Are you certain? Wade nodded, though his throat felt tight. It should be played. Sarah would have hated seeing it silent for so long. Emma rose gracefully and moved to the piano bench. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. It will need tuning soon, but let's see. When she began to play, the melody was gentle, a folk song Wade vaguely recognized. The notes filled the room, awkward at first as Emma adjusted to the instrument's idiosyncrasies, then increasingly fluid. Wade closed his eyes, allowing the music to wash over him. It should have hurt, hearing music in the house again. Instead, he felt something inside him unwinding, a knot of tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. When Emma finished the song, the final notes hung in the air between them. She turned on the bench to face him, her expression uncertain. Was that all right? Wade opened his eyes to find her watching him intently. Yes, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. It was. Thank you. Something passed between them, then an understanding, perhaps, or a shifting of what had been to what might be. Wade wasn't ready to name it, but for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of possibility. Emma seemed to sense his inner turmoil. She rose from the piano bench with a gentle smile. It's getting late. I should retire for the evening. Wade stood as well, suddenly awkward in a way he hadn't been around her before. Of course, good night, Miss Richards. Emma, she corrected softly. After all this time, I think you might call me Emma. Emma, he repeated, the name feeling right on his tongue. Good night." After she left, Wade remained in the study, staring at the piano. He'd kept so much of his past locked away, refusing to touch anything that reminded him of Sarah. Yet hearing music in the house again hadn't desecrated her memory as he'd feared it had honored it, bringing life back to spaces that had been preserved like a mausoleum. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, the first significant storm of the season. Wade watched the white flakes through the window, thinking of the winter ahead and, for the first time in years, feeling something akin to anticipation rather than dread. The snow continued through the night and into the following day, leaving Silverton blanketed in white. Wade woke before dawn as usual and found Emma already in the kitchen, stoking the stove and preparing coffee. "The passes will close soon if this keeps up," he commented, accepting the steaming cup she offered. Emma nodded, gazing out the window at the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful, though, like a different world." "A more isolated one," Wade warned. "Town trips become more difficult once the snow deepens. We should make a supply run today while the roads are still passable." They rode into Silverton together after breakfast, Wade on his horse and Emma in the small wagon they used for supplies. The town looked picturesque under its coating of snow, smoke rising from chimneys against the backdrop of white-capped mountains. At the general store, Mr. Peterson greeted them with unusual enthusiasm. "Miss Richards, Mr. Ravenwood, perfect timing, just received news from the town council. They've approved funds for school supplies and your teaching salary starting next month." Emma's face lit up with genuine delight. "That's wonderful news. I can begin ordering the necessary books and materials." As she discussed her requirements with Peterson, Wade noticed the curious glances directed their way by other customers. It occurred to him that this was the first time he and Emma had come to town together, and in a place like Silverton, such things didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Abbott, the banker's wife and a notorious gossip, approached them at the counter. "Miss Richards, how lovely to see you." "And Mr. Ravenwood, why, I don't believe I've seen you in town twice in a month for the past 2 years, and here you are again." Her tone carried an implication that made Wade stiffen. Emma, however, responded with perfect composure. "Mr. Ravenwood has been kind enough to provide me with employment and lodging while I establish myself in Silverton," she explained smoothly. "Now that I'll be teaching, I'll likely be seeking accommodations in town to be closer to the school." Wade frowned at this announcement, which was the first he'd heard of such plans. Mrs. Abbott didn't miss his reaction. "Oh, but the schoolhouse won't be ready until spring, I understand," she said with false innocence. "Surely Mr. Ravenwood's ranch is a perfectly adequate arrangement until then." "The ranch is some distance from town," Emma replied diplomatically. "Once classes begin regularly, the journey might prove impractical, especially in winter weather." Wade remained silent through this exchange, aware that Emma was attempting to protect both their reputations. In a small town like Silverton, an unmarried woman living in a widower's home, regardless of the circumstances, would eventually become fodder for gossip. After they'd completed their purchases and loaded the wagon, Wade finally spoke as they left town. "You didn't mention plans to move to town." Emma glanced at him, her expression carefully neutral. "I thought it might be for the best, given the circumstances. People will talk, Wade." "Let them," he said more forcefully than intended. "You've done nothing improper." "No, we haven't," she agreed. "But perception matters in a small community, especially for a teacher. I need the town's trust to be effective in my position." Wade understood her reasoning, though he disliked it. The thought of Emma leaving the ranch created an uncomfortable hollow, feeling in his chest, one he was finally beginning to recognize as attachment, perhaps even something deeper. They rode in silence for a time, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath hooves and wheels. Finally, Wade cleared his throat. "What if there were a more permanent arrangement?" Emma looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Wade kept his eyes on the road ahead, uncharacteristically nervous. "I mean, what if you had a legitimate reason to remain at the ranch, one no one in town could question?" For a moment, Emma said nothing, and Wade feared he'd been too oblique. Then, very softly, she asked, "Are you proposing something specific, Wade?" The directness of her question forced him to turn and meet her gaze. What he saw there, hope mingled with caution, gave him courage. "I'm not sure I remember how to do this properly," he admitted, reining his horse to a stop. "It's been a long time since I allowed myself to care for anyone." Emma halted the wagon beside him, her eyes never leaving his face. "Take your time," she said gently. "I'm listening." Wade removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of uncharacteristic vulnerability. "When Sarah died, I believed that part of me died with her. I didn't want to feel anything again, it hurt too much." He paused, searching for the right words. "But these past months with you in the house in my life, you've brought something back that I thought was gone forever." "Wade," Emma whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm not offering charity or convenience," he continued, needing her to understand. "I'm offering myself. If you could consider a future with a man who's been half alive for 2 years, who's still learning how to feel again." Snow continued to fall gently around them as Emma regarded him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Inelegantly, it seems," Wade replied, a small, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "But yes, I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife. Not immediately. I want to court you properly, give you time to be certain, but eventually, if you found you could care for me as I've come to care for you." Emma's hand went to her throat, where a blush was spreading across her skin. "I never expected this when I stepped off that stagecoach." "Nor did I," Wade admitted. "But life has a way of surprising us, I'm finding." For a long moment, Emma simply looked at him, snowflakes catching in her chestnut hair. Then, slowly, she extended her gloved hand toward him. "I would be honored to accept your courtship, Wade Ravenwood," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "And to consider a future together." Wade took her offered hand, marveling at the simple courage of her gesture. Here was a woman who had seen his brokenness, his grief, his hard edges, and still reached out without fear. As her fingers clasped his, something shifted inside Wade, a final piece of ice melting away from a heart he'd thought permanently frozen. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles through the glove. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing she would understand all he meant by those 2 words. They continued toward the ranch, riding side by side now rather than one following the other. The snow fell around them, covering the land in pristine white, a blank page on which they might write a new story together. The weeks leading up to Christmas transformed Silverton into a picture-perfect frontier town, with pine boughs decorating storefronts and lanterns glowing warmly against the early darkness. Emma began teaching in the church 3 days a week as planned, quickly becoming a beloved figure among the children and their parents alike. True to his word, Wade courted her properly. He escorted her to church on Sundays, sitting beside her during the service, his first regular church attendance since Sarah's funeral. He arranged for Miguel to drive her to and from town on teaching days when the weather was particularly harsh. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, reading or talking or simply enjoying each other's companionable silence. Word of their courtship spread quickly through town, met with general approval. Wade, standing as one of the area's most established ranchers, combined with Emma's position, as the new teacher made them a natural match in the community's eyes. Even Mrs. Abbott could find little to criticize, especially after Wade made a point of speaking with Reverend Michaels about his intentions toward Emma, making their courtship official in the most public way possible. As Christmas approached, Wade found himself facing the holiday with something other than dread for the first time since Sarah's death. Emma had decorated the ranch house with simple touches: pine branches, red ribbons, and candles that filled the rooms with a warm glow. She involved the children from her class in making paper ornaments, which now adorned a small pine tree in the corner of the parlor. "My first Christmas in Colorado," Emma remarked on Christmas Eve as they sat before the fire after dinner. Outside, snow fell steadily, adding to the already considerable accumulation. "It's more beautiful than I imagined." Wade watched her as she gazed into the flames, the firelight casting a golden glow on her features. Over the past months, he'd memorized the contours of her face, the subtle expressions that revealed her thoughts, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I thought tomorrow might be too public." The town had organized a Christmas gathering at the church, which they were expected to attend. Wade preferred this moment, private and intimate, for what he had planned. Emma looked at him with surprise. "You didn't need to get me anything." "I wanted to," he replied simply, placing a small package wrapped in brown paper in her hands. "It's not much, but I'm sure it's lovely," Emma interrupted gently, carefully unwrapping the paper. Inside was a small wooden box intricately carved with aspen leaves. When she opened it, a soft melody began to play, a simple music box mechanism Wade had ordered from Denver weeks earlier. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered, running her fingers over the delicate carving. "Open the lid fully," Wade instructed, his throat suddenly tight. Emma did as he asked, revealing a small compartment beneath the music works. There, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "Wade," she breathed, looking up at him with wide eyes. He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I meant what I said about courtship, about giving you time, but I also want you to know my intentions are sincere." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Emma. You brought light back into my life when I thought I would live in darkness forever." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she cupped his face in her hand. "I love you too. I think I have since that day on the porch, when you asked me to play the piano, when you let me into that part of your past." Wade took the ring from its box. "This doesn't have to be an engagement yet if you're not ready. It can be a promise until you're certain." Emma shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "I am certain, Wade. I've never been more certain of anything." With hands that trembled slightly, Wade slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the pearl catching the firelight. "Then, Emma Richards, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. And then she was in his arms, her lips finding his in their first kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as they both surrendered to the feelings they'd been carefully navigating for months. When they finally parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, savoring the moment. "I never thought I would feel this way again," he admitted softly. Emma's fingers traced the line of his jaw. "Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them. Or when we least believe we deserve them," Wade added, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. "You deserve happiness, Wade," Emma said firmly. "We both do." As they sat together before the fire, planning their future in quiet voices, the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in silence. For Wade, who had once sworn he would never love again, the woman beside him had accomplished what he'd thought impossible. She had placed her hand in his without fear, and in doing so, had led him back to life. Christmas Day dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. Wade woke to sunlight streaming through his window and the knowledge that, for the first time in years, the day ahead held promise rather than painful memories. He and Emma had agreed to wait until after the Christmas service to announce their engagement to the town. As they prepared for church, Wade noticed Emma had pinned her pearl ring to the inside of her dress, visible only to her, a secret joy they would share until the proper moment. The church was filled to capacity when they arrived, with many families from outlying homesteads having made the journey despite the snow. Emma's students rushed to greet her, presenting her with small handmade gifts that she accepted with genuine delight. Wade stood aside, watching her interaction with the children, imagining a future where their own children might look at her with such adoration. The thought no longer brought pain or guilt as it once would have. Sarah would always be part of his past, honored and remembered. But Emma was his future, a future he had never expected to find. After the service, Reverend Michaels invited everyone to share Christmas dinner in the church hall, tables groaning with dishes contributed by every family. As the meal concluded, Wade caught Emma's eye across the room, receiving her slight nod of confirmation. He rose to his feet, tapping his glass for attention. The hall gradually fell silent as people turned toward him in curiosity. Wade Ravenwood making a public announcement was unusual enough to command immediate interest. "I'll keep this brief," Wade began, unaccustomed to addressing such a gathering. "First, I want to thank you all for welcoming Miss Richards so warmly to our community. Silverton is fortunate to have found such a dedicated teacher." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd as Emma made her way to Wade's side, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "I also want to share some news," Wade continued, taking Emma's hand in his. "Last night, I asked Miss Richards to become my wife, and she has done me the great honor of accepting." For a moment, there was stunned silence, not at the courtship, which everyone had observed developing, but at the forthright declaration from a man many still considered Silverton's most reserved resident. Then applause broke out, led enthusiastically by Emma's students. Reverend Michaels stepped forward with a broad smile. "This calls for a celebration. When might we expect the wedding?" Wade looked to Emma, who squeezed his hand before addressing the crowd. "We thought perhaps this spring, once the schoolhouse is completed and the passes are clear enough for Wade's sister in Denver to travel here." More applause followed, along with a flurry of congratulations as people came forward to wish them well. Mrs. Abbott, not to be outdone, immediately began suggesting plans for a proper wedding reception. "I think we've created a monster," Wade murmured in Emma's ear as the banker's wife detailed her vision for floral arrangements. Emma laughed softly. "A small price to pay for such goodwill, I think." Looking around at the genuine happiness on the faces surrounding them, Wade had to agree. For too long, he had isolated himself from this community, existing alongside it but not truly part of it. Through Emma, he was finding his way back. The winter months passed in a blur of preparations, both for the wedding and for Emma's transition to the new schoolhouse. Wade found himself increasingly involved in town affairs, joining the committee overseeing the school's construction, and even attending social gatherings he would have avoided in the past. Emma flourished in her teaching role, introducing innovations that impressed even the most traditional families. She organized a lending library with books donated by wealthier residents, and established an adult education program 2 evenings a week for those who wished to improve their reading or mathematics. At the ranch, they settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Wade expanded the vegetable garden at Emma's suggestion, planning for the coming growing season. They discussed improvements to the house, a larger kitchen, perhaps, and eventually additional bedrooms for the family they both hoped to have. By March, as the first signs of spring appeared in the valley, the schoolhouse was nearing completion. Emma spent increasing time there, arranging furniture and organizing supplies as the wedding date approached. Do you think she would have approved? Wade asked Miguel one afternoon as they inspected a newly broken fence line. It was the first time he had spoken directly of Sarah to anyone in years. Miguel, who had worked for Wade since before his marriage to Sarah, considered the question carefully. "Your first wife had a generous heart, Patron. She would not have wanted you to live alone in sorrow forever." He adjusted his hat thoughtfully. "Miss Emma, she brings light where there was darkness. I think Senora Sarah would see this and be glad." Wade nodded, grateful for the honest assessment. "That's what I believe too. And you, Patron. The darkness that was in you, it has gone." "Not entirely," Wade admitted. "There are still moments, memories that return unexpectedly, but they no longer consume me as they once did." Miguel smiled. "This is good. To remember with love instead of pain, this is how it should be." As they rode back to the ranch, Wade reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. The man who had sworn never to love again had been transformed not by forgetting his past, but by finding the courage to build a future despite it. Emma was waiting on the porch when they returned, a telegram in her hand and excitement on her face. "It's from your sister," she called as Wade dismounted. "She and her family will arrive next week in plenty of time for the wedding." Wade smiled at her enthusiasm. "Good. It will be good to see her again." He hadn't seen his sister since Sarah's funeral, another relationship he had allowed to wither in his grief. Reconnecting with her had been Emma's gentle suggestion, one of many ways she had encouraged him to heal connections he had severed. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and pink, Emma leaned against Wade's shoulder, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin. "Are you nervous about the wedding?" she asked quietly. Wade considered the question honestly. "Not about marrying you," he answered. "Only about being worthy of the chance you've given me." Emma lifted her head to look at him. "Wade Ravenwood, you are the most honorable, decent man I've ever known. I'm not giving you a chance, I'm making the easiest choice of my life." He kissed her then, still marveling at the simple joy of being able to do so. When they parted, Wade kept her close, reluctant to break the connection between them. "I was thinking," Emma said, tracing patterns on the back of his hand with her finger. "The schoolhouse will be finished next month, and classes will resume in the new building." Wade nodded, waiting for her to continue. "The town council has offered me living quarters above the schoolroom, as is common for teachers." A frown creased Wade's brow. "You're considering it." "After we're married," Emma laughed softly. "No, of course not, but I was thinking perhaps we could offer it to someone else. Another teacher, perhaps, to help with the growing number of students. Or," she hesitated, "or perhaps to a family in need of a fresh start, as I once was." Wade studied her face in the fading light. "You're thinking of paying forward the kindness I showed you." "Was it only kindness?" Emma asked with a small smile. "No," Wade admitted. "Even then, something about you I couldn't turn away." Emma nodded, satisfied. "Then perhaps someone else deserves the same opportunity. To find a place where they belong, where they can build something new." Wade considered her suggestion, warming to the idea. "We could establish a proper scholarship for the school as well. Ensure any child who wants an education can receive one, regardless of their family's circumstances." Emma's eyes brightened with approval. "I would like that very much." "Then we'll do it," Wade decided, "together." The week before the wedding brought clear skies and warming temperatures, perfect for the arrival of Wade's sister and her family from Denver. Catherine was 3 years younger than Wade, with the same dark hair and strong features, though her expression held none of the hardness that had characterized her brothers for so long. The siblings' reunion was initially awkward, with too much unspoken history between them. But Catherine had brought her husband, and their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl whose energy and curiosity quickly broke through the tension. "You've changed," Catherine told Wade privately on their second evening, as they watched Emma teaching her niece to play the piano. "When I saw you last, I feared you were lost to us forever," Wade nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "I was lost to myself as well." Catherine squeezed his arm gently. "Emma is remarkable. I see why you love her." "She saved me," Wade said simply. Though she would disagree with that assessment. "The best ones always do," Catherine replied with a knowing smile. "They don't set out to save anyone, they simply love fully, and in doing so, show us how to save ourselves." The day of the wedding dawned clear and mild, with wildflowers beginning to bloom across the valley. The entire town of Silverton seemed to have turned out for the occasion, filling the church to capacity and spilling out onto the grounds. Wade stood at the altar beside Reverend Michaels, Miguel serving as his best man. Catherine had helped Emma prepare at the ranch, and Wade waited with uncharacteristic nervousness for his bride's arrival. When Emma finally appeared at the church doors on the arm of Mr. Peterson, who had volunteered to give her away in the absence of her father, Wade felt the same breathless recognition he had experienced the first time he saw her stepping off the stagecoach. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her chestnut hair adorned with mountain wildflowers rather than a formal veil. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of early spring blossoms gathered from the meadows near their ranch. As she walked toward him, Emma's eyes never left his face, her smile radiating a joy that matched the fullness in his own heart. When she reached his side and placed her hand in his, the same trusting gesture that had first begun to melt his frozen heart, Wade felt the last of his doubts dissolve. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Michaels began, addressing the gathered community, "we are assembled here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, but when it came time for their vows, Wade and Emma had chosen to speak their own words rather than the standard recitation. Emma, Wade began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I once believed that love was something I could experience only once in a lifetime. I was wrong. He squeezed her hands gently. You showed me that the heart can heal, that joy can follow sorrow, that life continues even when we think it has ended. I promise to love you with the wisdom of someone who understands how precious and fragile happiness can be. I promise to cherish every day we're granted together, to honor your strength and your kindness, and to be the partner you deserve in all our adventures ahead. Tears shimmered in Emma's eyes as she responded, Wade, when I came west, I was seeking a new beginning, but I found something far greater. I found you. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze remained unwavering. In your quiet strength, in your integrity, in the way you gradually opened your wounded heart to me, I discovered what true courage looks like. I promise to stand beside you through whatever life brings us, to respect the past that shaped you while building our future together, and to love you completely, the man you were, the man you are, and the man you will become. The rings, please, Reverend Michaels requested, and Miguel stepped forward with the simple gold bands they had chosen. As Wade slipped the ring onto Emma's finger to join her pearl engagement ring, and she placed his band on his finger, the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. Their kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet full of promise for the privacy that would come later. The celebration that followed at the newly completed schoolhouse, Emma's choice of venue, lasted well into the evening. Tables were laden with food contributed by every family in attendance, and a local string band provided music for dancing. Wade surprised everyone, including his new wife, by leading Emma onto the floor for the first dance. I didn't know you danced, she whispered as he guided her with unexpected grace. Sarah insisted I learn years ago, he admitted. I haven't since. Well, but some things it seems the body remembers. Emma's eyes softened with understanding. Thank you for sharing that with me. For letting her be part of today, Wade nodded, throat tight with emotion. She would have liked you, Emma, very much. As the evening progressed, Wade found himself surrounded by community in a way he hadn't been for years, sharing stories with neighbors, accepting congratulations, watching Emma interact with her students and his niece and nephews. The isolation he had imposed on himself seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by connections he had once thought permanently severed. When they finally departed for the ranch, their home, now truly shared, the townspeople lined the road with lanterns, illuminating their path as they rode away in the wagon festooned with ribbons and flowers by Emma's students. Happy? Wade asked simply as they crested the ridge that overlooked their property. Emma leaned against his shoulder, her new wedding ring catching the moonlight. Completely. And you? Wade drew the wagon to a halt, turning to look at his wife in the silver light. I never imagined I could feel this way again, he said honestly. When Sarah died, I thought that part of me died too. I said I'd never love again, I believed it. And now, Emma prompted gently, now I understand that love doesn't diminish what came before. It doesn't replace or erase. Wade brushed a strand of hair from her face. It builds on what we've learned, who we've become. You didn't ask me to forget my past, Emma. You helped me carry it and still move forward. Emma's eyes shimmered with tears as she placed her palm against his cheek. That's what love should do. Help us carry each other's burdens while celebrating each other's joys. As Wade leaned down to kiss his wife beneath the vast Colorado sky, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The cowboy who had sworn never to love again had found healing in the steady gaze of a woman who had placed her hand in his without fear, and in doing so, had shown him the way back to life. 5 years later, the Ravenwood ranch had transformed almost as dramatically as its owner. The house had been expanded with a new wing to accommodate their growing family, 3-year-old Sarah Catherine, named for both Wade's first wife and his sister, and 1-year-old William, a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's intelligent eyes. The original schoolhouse, where Emma had once taught, had been replaced by a larger building as Silverton continued to grow. Though Emma had stepped back from full-time teaching after Sarah's birth, she still served on the school board and occasionally substituted when needed. More importantly, She had established a scholarship fund that ensured every child in the county who wished to learn could do so, regardless of their family's circumstances. Wade had expanded the ranch operations, breeding horses alongside the cattle that had been his original focus. His reputation as one of the territory's most knowledgeable ranchers had spread, bringing visitors from as far as Denver seeking his advice. The bitter, isolated man of years past was unrecognizable in the respected community leader he had become. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Wade arranged for Catherine to watch the children while he took Emma on a picnic to the aspen grove where he had first proposed. Spring had come early that year, with wildflowers already carpeting the meadows and warm sunshine filtering through the pale green leaves of the aspens. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Wade asked, as they spread a blanket beneath the trees. Emma smiled, the same smile that still quickened his pulse after all their years together. "How could I forget? I was terrified you were taking me somewhere to tell me our arrangement wasn't working out," Wade laughed, pulling her down beside him. "Instead, I asked you to make it permanent." "Best decision I ever made," Emma replied, leaning against his shoulder in a gesture that had become so familiar yet never lost its comfort. Wade wrapped his arm around her, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Do you ever regret it, coming west, taking a chance on a broken man and a remote ranch?" Emma lifted her head to look at him directly. "Never, not for a single moment." Her expression grew thoughtful. "Do you ever still think of her, of Sarah?" It was a question she rarely asked, not from jealousy but from respect for his past. Wade nodded slowly. "Yes. Less often now and differently than before. I think she would be proud of what we've built here, the family, the community work." He pressed a kiss to Emma's forehead. "She would especially approve of you." Emma smiled gently. "I like to think so." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the aspen leaves rustling in the breeze and the distant sounds of the ranch. Finally, Wade reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package. "For our anniversary," he said, placing it in Emma's hands. 5 years doesn't seem possible." Emma unwrapped the gift carefully to reveal a locket on a delicate gold chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny portrait of their 2 children on one side, and on the other an inscription, "For the woman who taught me to love again." "Wade," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "It's beautiful." He took the necklace from her hands and fastened it around her neck, the gold warm against her skin. "Not as beautiful as you or the life you've given me." Emma touched the locket where it rested against her heart. "We gave each other this life, that's the wonder of it." As the afternoon sun filtered through the aspen leaves, casting dappled shadows across the blanket where they sat, Wade Ravenwood marveled at the journey that had brought him here. Once he had been a man consumed by grief, convinced that love was a one-time gift that, once lost, could never be reclaimed. Then Emma had stepped off a stagecoach and into his world, placing her hand in his without fear, and everything had changed. "I love you," he said simply, words that had once been impossible for him to speak now flowing easily from his heart. "And I love you," Emma replied, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the land they both cherished and thinking of the family waiting for them at home, Wade knew a contentment he had once thought forever beyond his reach. The cowboy who had sworn never to love again had found not just love, but a second chance at the life he had thought ended with his first wife's death. And it had all begun with a woman brave enough to see beyond his walls, to reach out her hand, and a man who, despite his vow, had found the courage to take it.